Okay, thank you everyone for joining. I think we can start, so please have a seat. So I am happy to introduce to you Katrina Exter, and she used to be one of our colleagues here. She was a postdoc here in the PAX team, so she worked in the instrumentation team. Afterwards, she moved to the Flemish Marine Institute, if I understand well. And one of her tasks there is to do data management, and she would like to tell her about her experiences over there so that we can learn from her. You have the floor, please.
Okay, thanks. Yes, so I work at the Open Science team of the data center of the Flanders Marine Institute, also known as Flanders Institute for the Zee, which is in Ostende. And this is a data center, a marine station where they do marine sampling and a research group. In the data center, we do data work for the marine biology and environmental sciences in Flanders, working also with other institutes in Belgium and Europe and other countries of the world. So, so the reason that someone from a marine institute is giving a talk about data management is because I used to work here, and when Joris asked if I'd like to give a talk, I said, yeah, it'd be kind of nice to see the old place again, see the young people I used to work with. Yes. And I'm sure that you would find it far more interesting if I talked about marine biology, but I'm not a marine biologist. I manage the data of marine biology, and I've learned an awful lot more than I thought I ever would, but I'm not a marine biologist. I'm a data manager, so I'm going to talk about data management. Now, this is something that's become very important in the environmental sciences, particularly because, very similar to astronomy, a lot of the research, like probably 90% of the research, is funded by either the EU or in Flanders, the Flemish government. And doing data management, making your data fair and open, which are concepts I will explain, has become extremely important to these funding agencies, and therefore it's extremely important to us. Now, I know that this is also important in some areas of astronomy, and there are research infrastructures in astronomy and physics that that I also work with. But it's definitely something that was new to me when I started at the Flanders Marine Institute, and I suspect it's probably new to most of you as well. So most people, when I say data management, really don't know what it is. I mean, you understand the words, of course, but what it is on a day-to-day basis is rather unclear. Some of you who know about data management or are told that you should do some data management, you'll be thinking, no, please, I don't want to do this, right? It's asking me to do some extra work and stuff I don't need to do, and why do I need to do it in the first place? But to me, and hopefully by the end of the talk to you, data managers are superheroes, and the work we do, believe me, is superheroic. What we do is enable science not to happen, but to be shared, to be made accessible to other people. And other people means other scientists, but it also means society as a whole. It also means, for marine biology in particular, policymakers, politicians, and those people who make decisions about how dirty our oceans are allowed to be. So I will start off with something that's a little bit more interesting than data management, and I'll tell you something about the kind of data that we deal with in marine biology. It was, for me, when I moved there, it was quite an eye-opener to see the variety of data sets, data types of experiments that they do in marine biology. It is really quite different to astronomy in that sense. So at the Flanders Marine Institute, we manage the data that we get. We also produce our own data. So the types of data we deal with are what are called observations, but in this case, it's an observation of a creature, or an organism rather, in a place at a time, and how many of them. So you count how many organisms you see at a certain place at a certain time, and that's an observation. Observations are done with collecting devices. A bucket, believe it or not, is a collecting device, but there are, of course, more sophisticated collecting devices. You have sampling devices that are used in the marine environment. These are called settlement plates. These are kind of like sort of plastic plates like this that you put down on the bottom of the sea in harbors and marinas, and then organisms come and live on them, and then you go and look to see what's living there. So this is a way of looking and see what organisms are where, how many, and when. Observations also take the place of tagging. You'll probably be familiar with the idea of tagging birds, but they also tag fish, even little ones. And then the tags, they collect data continuously, and then they drop off, they pop up, and hopefully someone will find them and post them to IvS. Also, some of the tags, they emit a signal at a certain frequency, and when they go past these stations, they get the signal gets caught, and then they get tracked that way. We also do soundscape observations, so the sound environment in the ocean from the animals, but also the sound coming from shipping vessels, and they use hydrophones to do that. Then there's survey data, so where you cover a large piece of space and time, a lot of Earth observation, for example, the Copernicus program. And these were the data I was most comfortable with in the beginning, because it's the same as astronomy, right? Instead of looking up, you're looking down, but it's the same sorts of instruments, collecting the same sorts of data, and it all comes from ESA. So you've got the same sort of issues dealing with ESA there. But there's also survey data that comes from drones and planes. For the marine environment, we have underwater surveys that are carried out either by divers or by marine robots. And these gathers images and videos and photogrammetry, which I'll show you in a few slides. Lately, we've been dealing a lot with genomics, so it's DNA. Glottic collecting of environmental DNA, so you collect a sample of water or soil, process it, and then you look at the DNA to see what creatures, what organisms were there. We also do something, or we deal with data to deal with functional genomics, so rather than looking at the DNA to see what species are there, you look at the DNA to see what functions are there. This is a piece of DNA that allows some fish to produce some particular protein. This is a DNA that allows the fish to see something. And these are called functional genomics. So you maybe can't identify the species, but you can identify what the species are doing within themselves in a certain area. And then we have recently projects working with AIS. This is automatic identification system. So all ships are supposed to have these black boxes that send out a signal that says where they are and which direction and how fast they're going. And this is a legal requirement. So you can use these signals to make maps of the tracks of the vessels. The Belgian part of the North Sea is an extremely busy part of the European waters. And you can do then sorts of analyses on these tracks. You can identify the type of vessel, for example, based on the type of track, the behavior of that track. You can use this then to look at disturbance sites to see where fishing may be disturbing the organic environment. And it's also used, of course, for traffic management, particularly when the ships come into the harbours and they go up Celt and on to Zeebrugge and to Antwerp. So some of the instruments that we have at the Flanders Marine Institute, was that one, wasn't it? No, it wasn't that one. Press it again. It'll disappear. So this here is the Simon Steven, which is the main research vessel that they have at IvS, which goes out fairly frequently for one day or for several days, and then it does various collecting along the entire Belgian part of the North Sea, occasionally into France. How do I get rid of that thing? Escape is where? There. Okay. This is a collecting device. It's a plankton net. I know it doesn't look very sophisticated, but producing the fine mesh here and having multiple layers of it is not completely, I mean, there's some sophistication involved in producing it, but this is a collecting device. This is called a CTD. It's a series of plastic bottles. They close them, they drop it down to a certain depth, flip the lids open, water comes in, close the lids, lift it back up again. That's the way you can collect water at a certain depth. And then in situ, they measure the temperature of the water as they collect it, and afterwards they measure the salinity of the water that's been collected. So that's the way they measure different things at different depths. This is one of our robots, marine robots. There's several of those. They go out and they do surveying, particularly along the where all the wind parks. There's a lot of survey work that's done around there, and also survey work done for all the munitions that we have still in the Belgian part of the North Sea. That one up here is a hydrophone, so it makes measurements of the soundscape in the environment. Here we've got a diver. with a video camera. These video cameras don't just record the video, but they also record X, Y, Z in time. And it allows these images later to be turned into 3D images. This is one of these settlement plates that I was talking about. I deal with a lot of the data from these. So stacks of plates, you put them down in a harbor, you leave them there from anywhere from a few weeks to a few months. Organisms come and sit on them, they basically populate them, and then you take them up, and then you look to see what organisms are there. And this is a buoy. You have instruments that measure the wind, but you've also got instruments that hang off underneath the buoy and also make continuous measurements of the sea's environment. So now I'm going to show you, so these are some raw data that we collect. This is a spectrum of the sound of porpoises that we have quite a lot of in the Belgian part of the North Sea. And from these raw data, we make these intermediate data products. I'm using these words, raw data and intermediate data, deliberately, because I'm going to talk about them in a bit. So you make measurements, the frequency, the duration, the width, the volume, and so on, and you make measurements, and you record these in spreadsheets. A lot of biological data is recorded in spreadsheets. These are images of plankton that came out of the plankton net. You've got these sort of high-speed cameras that allow you to take pictures of plankton as they go through a pipette of water past the camera lens. And you count up on a spreadsheet the number of species you found in a certain volume of water that was collected at a certain place in a certain time. So these are observations. From these settlement plate units, we get two types of raw data. These are the images of the units, and you can use AI to identify what organisms you see there. And then you make a spreadsheet of what you saw, how many of them, and when the plate was in the water, and therefore when these organisms, and where they come from. They're also then scraped, blended, and processed into DNA. So we kill them all, of course, and this DNA, so this is a sequence this is a small segment of a sequence of DNA from one particular sort of part of the entire DNA. And I don't have the species names here, but you compare these sequences to a library of sequences. It's basically pattern matching. It's sophisticated mathematics. And you get a species out. So that's another type of data set. And then, well, not quite finally, we have, this is photogrammetry. So these divers, but also from robots. You have these videos tagged with X, Y, Z in time, and you can patch this together to create a 3D image of ships, munitions, the bases of wind farms. They're also used to study degradation in coral reefs. And the important thing about this is it doesn't damage the environment, because otherwise, if you want to go down and look at things, you often can damage what it is you're looking at. This is an AIS track, so these are tracks of ships. This is the Belgian part of the North Sea. This is Belgium, Ostender is here, this is the UK. And so these are, I think this is a week or a month, I can't remember exactly, but this is what it looks like, of just all the ships that went past at that particular point in time. And you can create data products from this product. For example, this is a map of the most popular fishing areas, the Belgian part of the North Sea, which you can get because you know what the track of a fishing ship looks like. And then here is a map of the tagged data. It's just a map that shows what creatures were seen when, where, and how many of them. And finally, the kind of images you get from Earth observations. So this is the Black Sea. This is a map of the currents. And if you combine this with in situ observations of the physics and the chemistry of the water, for example, looking at the pollution of the water, the temperature of the water, you can use this to tell people where it's good to go bathe and where it's bad to go bathe. Okay, so that's the interesting part of the talk. Now it's the important part of the talk, which is the data management. And I'll start by explaining some concepts, and then I'll give you some, well, practical guides to actually how you can go about doing data management, how we do data management, and how I tell any audience, marine biologists or astronomers, how they can go about doing data management. Now, open science is a big movement in the EU funding landscape these days. Right? The EU is really keen on open science, on returning to society what society is paid for. And to society means fellow scientists, but it also means, like I said, particularly for environmental sciences, it means policymakers, because they have to make decisions based on actual science. So it's about providing unhindered access to scientific results and outputs, particularly where they've been publicly funded. So that means access to the data from the research, the raw data. So in your case, that would be the raw FITS files that come off the telescope, to the process data. So that's when you've, for example, taken a raw FITS file and you've made a nice image from it or a nice spectrum from it. You've turned it into proper units. You've given it, X and Y proper units. And any data products that you will create in the process of working on your science. So it's not just about publications, it's about the data as well. The publications should be published in open access journals, if at all possible, or at least the publications themselves should be made open access. And also the software, any tools or software that you write in the process of doing your research, that should also be made open access. FAIR, have any of you heard of FAIR data before? Right, okay, so it's an acronym. It stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable, and it's about making open science possible. So it's all very well to say, here's my data, you can have it. It's open, anybody can use it. Well, first they have to find it, right? They have to be able to find it, first of all, and that means they have to be able to find it on the web. They have to be able to access it. You have to be able to give it to them, or they have to rather be able to get it. They have to be able to understand it, and they have to be able to use it. So the acronym stands for the principles that will allow you to make open science actually practical open science. So findable does mean I want to find some data or some science, and I want to find it now. I don't want to spend weeks trying to look for it. I don't want to go to 15 different publications in some journals which I may not have access to because they're not open access, and then have to dig around and send people emails and ask them for it. Google can be used to find so much disinformation, right? So we should be able to make Google find information. The science is really important in our society, so we should be making it possible for anybody to find a scientific data or a scientific result. Accessible means I found the data, now I need to be able to get it, right? I said, oh, there's a data set here, now I want it. I want to be able to download it. Interoperable means now I've downloaded it, I want to be able to do something with it. I want to be able to open it. I need to be able to open it. It means that you have to have formats that are current, formats that are open, and the data in the data set needs to be self-describing. I shouldn't have to send an email to somebody and say, what does this mean? It should be self-describing. And reusable means, first of all, I have to know how I can use it, so basically a license. But I need to know how it was made. I need to know the provenance of the data set. I need that so I can trust it, and I need that so I know how I can use it to do my science. Okay, so that's what FAIR means. So how would you go about making data or software findable? The first thing you should do is before you start a research project or any kind of a project, big or small, you should write a data management plan. Now, I know it sounds really boring, but believe me, if you write a data management plan before you start your project, it will really help you run your project. It'll make it much easier to sort of work with your data and share your data afterwards, and it will add some structure to the project. So a data management plan, and also, by the way, funding agencies require you to write a data management plan. But for me, a data management plan is a practical thing, right? What data are you going to be using? What data are you going to be producing? What software and methods are you going to be using? How were the data processed, or how will they be processed? How were they created? How will they be processed? Who did the work? And where? Where did the data come from? And by that I mean, in your case, what point of the sky did it come from? And for marine biology, what point in the sea did it come from? And where will the data go to for me to share that, for me to make that data findable? Next thing you should do is to share, which also means publish, your data. So not just the scientific results, but your data, the raw, the processed, the data products, on online portals or archives or catalogs. In marine biology, there are actually quite a lot of online archives and portals where you can store your biological data and your results. I seem to recall from when I was doing astronomy that there's a lot less, but there are generic places that you can use. Zenodo is one provided by the EU, where you can put your data, you can make the metadata descriptions of your data set and actually put your data set so it can be found by other people. And when you do that, you need to make a good metadata description of the data set. So you need to describe what's in the data, who made it, you need to give it, if you have contact details, a citation that people should quote when they use your data set, license, and some keywords to describe the data set. And the same goes for software. In marine biology, we use something called Workflow Hub and Galaxy, which I spelled wrong, never mind. But GitHub is also a perfectly acceptable way of sharing your software. Now, this work is your responsibility, right? Only you can share, can make your data findable. And when I mean you, I mean both you, actual individual scientists, but I also mean the institute, right? VLIS in the case of where I'm working, IvS in the case of where you're working. It's the institute of these people to make the data findable. To make it accessible, once you've published your data in an online portal, it will get what's called a metadata record, where you've described the data set. This is data about something, and my name is Katrina Exter. When I produce this data on this date, and so on and so forth. Within that metadata record, you can put a link to the data set where it can be downloaded, as well as the conditions of use. CC BY is a common one. You're allowed to use it any way you want, but you have to reference me. The archive itself should provide APIs, so web tools that will allow software developers to access the data automatically, the data and the metadata. So it doesn't have to be human sort of clicking on things. It can be done through a program. The archive that you put your metadata record in should also provide continuous update information, and it should link the data to whatever other related publications or data sets there are out there. A lot of archives in marine biology harvest from each other, so you put it in the European Ocean Biogeographic Information System, for example, and then it gets harvested by the Global Ocean Biogeographic Information System, and from there is harvested by another general biogeographic information system. That's less common in astronomy, I have to say, but there you are. So the more the data set is spread around, the more it will get known. And the more it's get known, the more it gets used, and the more it gets used, the more you will be quoted and referenced and cited. So it's also good for you guys to publish your data, because if it's used, then you get acknowledgement for that use. For software to make it accessible, it's good to provide it in containers like Docker so that it can be run on any operating system, and it can be run 10 years from now as well. So the responsibility for this work is mostly the portals. They have to provide the APIs, they have to provide the technical infrastructure. They're the ones who do the harvesting, but it's also your responsibility to make sure that you put the links to the data sets, you put your software in containers, and so on. To make your data interoperable, you have to use proprietary formats. Excel, strictly speaking, is a proprietary format, whereas CSV isn't. FITS is a non-proprietary format. You don't have to pay to get software to open a FITS file. You should use developer-friendly data formatting. Now, I know all of you will be doing coding, so you'll know what I mean. If you want to read a spreadsheet without having to do lots of if-then-elses, the spreadsheet's got to be rectangular. Rows and columns all filled in with one type of value in a column. Don't use colors to indicate something, right? Does that mean that you don't do that? Or that you've had problems with people providing shitty spreadsheets? So you need to have really nice, clean spreadsheets that are developer-friendly. The data need to be semantically enriched. Now that means that you need to have metadata to explain what they are. If you have a column that says F, you have to explain what F means, right? So you have to have another sort of metadata spreadsheet basically that says F equals whatever. And ideally, the metadata come from controlled vocabularies. So, for example, I've measured temperature, and I've written temp, okay? Does temp mean temporary or temperature? Right, okay. Temperature of what? Temperature of the sea, temperature of the air, temperature at what depth? Okay, so then instead I write temperature of the sea at 10 meters. Okay, that's a really crappy title, but okay, that's what I'm going to call it. Fine, so someone who understands English and has eyeballs can read it and can understand it, but a piece of software can't understand that, right? If there are two spreadsheets and one says temperature of the sea and the other one says temp sea, then you have to have an if-then else inside your code to understand both those two things mean the same. What you do instead is out there on the web, in marine biology, I suspect a lot more in astrophysics, there's these dictionaries, these vocabularies online, and there is a URL that points to a record that says temperature of the sea, degree of hotness or coldness of marine water. And there it has a URL that never changes. It'll be something, 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 UXPY. And that means temperature of the sea at 10 meters. And every time a piece of code sees that URL, it knows exactly what it's looking at. So that's what it means to make terms machine understandable, not just machine accessible, but machine understandable. For advanced interoperability, then you need to call on data specialists. This is work that we're doing at the Flanders Marine Institute to make your data Google friendly, so it can be found by Google. Google-friendly data packaging and formatting using linked data and the semantic web technology. And that is the aim in the end. The aim is that you can Google for cat memes, you can Google for Eurovision, but try Googling for some particular data set. It's a pain in the backside. The ultimate aim is that you can Google for whatever data you want. So this is your responsibility. You have to do this. You, again, you individually, you as an institute, you as a university. But you have to use data specialists at this point, right? You guys are astrophysicists. That's your speciality. You're not expected to be data specialists. But your scientific infrastructure should be providing data specialists who can give you the tools to do this. Reusable means giving data licenses. So this is a citation. This is how you can use the data. And it means giving provenance. Who created the data? What formats and types of the data? What kind of content is in the data set? How were the data collected and processed? Where were the data taken? And when were the data taken? The provenance is important for trustability. If you don't provide provenance, how do I know I can trust your data? And this is particularly important, again, in marine biology, because a lot of the data we give ends up, hopefully, on the politicians' laps and to make policies. And they have to know that they can trust the data, so you have to provide the provenance. So it's a responsibility of you to provide the provenance information, but it's a responsibility of the portals or the archives where you put your data to give you somewhere to do that. And that's something we're also working on a lot at VLIS. Okay, so how can you make individuals, institute, university, how can you make your science open and your data fair? First of all, you have to decide how important it is to you. I mean, that's an obvious statement, but if it's not important to you, then don't do it. But if it is important to you, decide to what extent it's important to you. Write a data management plan. And that data management plan is a living document. In the beginning of a project, you'll write what you intend to do and everything you know already. But as you go through your project, you will do things, and then you write down what you've actually done. And a data management plan should be practical, right? Not blah, blah. And a lot of the DMPs that you'll be required to write to get your funding will probably be blah, blah. But keep it set. What data did I collect? What did I do with it? What is its format? Where is it? What software did I use? What version of the software did I use? Really, just literally listing the things that you did to the data. Templates for different types of projects, template DMPs for different types of projects should be provided by your institute. Next thing is to start the data management from the very beginning. If you do it at the end, it's 100 times worse for a fraction of the result. If you do it at the end, it's almost not worth doing it at all. You have to do it from the beginning. It's like cleaning your house. If you do a little bit every day, 5 minutes, 10 minutes every day, your house is always clean. If you do nothing for a month, it's a complete shit heap, and it will take you forever to clean. A little bit every day, that's the way to go. You need to keep track of all the steps in the data life cycle. So every time you start a new bit of work on a data set, fill in a spreadsheet to record what you're doing. Spreadsheet template of these, well, spreadsheet or a text file, but spreadsheets are always better. Templates of these should be also provided by the institute that you work at. And within there, you describe in sort of short words what it is that you've done to the data. I use this piece of software, I use this version, this is a URL pointing to the software, and this is the parameter file that I put into the software, for example. And the Institute should also provide reference file with the control vocabularies that you can use, the semantically enhanced metadata that you can put into your spreadsheet, because these are not things that you are expected to know just, automatically yourself. Decide where you're going to publish your data, not your science. We use a lot of biodiversity archives. Zenodo, provided by the EU, is a good place that you can use if there isn't one somewhere else. I know that ESA, when we were working for Herschel, you could put back into the archives data products that you had created from the raw data that they had in there. If they do that with other satellites, that would be a good thing to do. The GitHub is also a good fallback, and in fact, we are using at the moment GitHub to do quite a lot of data management. When it comes to making your data sets machine interoperable and machine understandable, then call on the experts to help you do that. And finally, I recommend everybody to get an ORC ID. Not only is it a good showcase of yourself, because on your ORC ID, you get an ID, you put on there your name, your contact details, your resume, your publications. So it's good to have if you're applying for jobs, but it's also good for data managers, because a number of times I've got a data set with an email on it that's just old because the person's moved on. But if I have their ORC ID and they keep their record up to date, then I can always find out. I can always contact them. Right, now, how am I for time? Yours? Okay, well in that case I'm going to go on to give an example of what we do at the Open Science team at VLIS for one particular project that we're working on. Now this is a biodiversity observation network, BON, and that means that we are a network of partners making observations of biodiversity. The image I showed of this sort of plate with all these sort of crustaceans on it, these are called settlement plates. They're actually called ARMS units, Autonomous Reef Monitoring Structures. The data we get come from these units. We put the units down in the harbours, about 26 partners spread over Europe and in the Antarctic, and we put them down for several months to half a year at a time. Then we pick them up, we take photographs, identify the organisms, we scrape them, blend them, and get the DNA, and from the DNA we also identify organisms. So it's two different ways. The DNA is particularly useful because, of course, you can't see the microscopic creatures from the images, but you can see them in the DNA. So what happens is that we have our scientists, so ARMS is one of them, but we also collect samples of water and of soil. So we have our 26 partners, they go out on a regular occasion, they collect their samples of water and soil, and every 6 months they collect their ARMS units, and we use Google Sheets, very simple, very user-friendly Google Sheets, to fill in the information. This ship went out on this time to this place, collected this much water from this depth, and by the way, we measured this chlorophyll, we measure this salinity, we measure this temperature, we measure this nitrogen and pigments and all sorts of other things. So they make very simple entries into Google Sheets, which we have rigorously formatted so that they can only enter certain types of information in certain ways. So what we do, so this is basically, it's a Google Sheet, right, with information in it. So what we do is we upload these Google Sheets. We do a round of quality control. For example, you can see here there's a missing row. And in some cases, even though you really try very hard to tell biologists how to enter numbers, the fact is, another thing that shocked me is that biologists have no respect for numbers. They will give you a number to a precision of 10 significant digits, not realizing that it's only actually accurate to one significant digit. So we do a round of quality control to make sure the entries are all as they should be, because these data are going to be shared with everybody, so they have to be correct from the very beginning. So we harvest these into GitHub. Each tab on the Google Sheet becomes a CSV file, because that's an open access format, in a repository in GitHub. What we then do is create an ontology. Does anybody know what an ontology is? Does anybody know what a vocabulary is? Does anybody know what a dictionary is? All right. A dictionary is words and definitions. It's pretty much what a vocabulary is as well. An ontology is a glorified vocabulary. So you don't just have a set of words. For example, you will have a term, temperature, definition, degree of hotness or coldness. Within the space of temperature, you've got air temperature, water temperature, soil temperature. So you've got different types of temperature which are sitting underneath temperature. So you have a vocabulary with a hierarchy and relationships. Within sea temperature, you can have brackish water, so semi-salty, salty water, and river water. Okay, so different types of temperatures. So you've got terms with definitions, but in addition, they have relationships between them, they have a hierarchy, and they can also have sort of attributes. This temperature has to have a unit. The units will be Fahrenheit, Celsius, or Kelvin. Okay, so you create an ontology in order to define all the different terms that you're collecting from your spreadsheets, essentially. But it also acts as a bit of a data model. It says what the relationships are for the different types of data. Because as well as collecting these spreadsheets with all these measurements in it, from the physical samples that are collecting, they're processed into images, they're processed into DNA. And so we have to link, and then the DNA is analyzed to get species, species, taxonomic information about the species. So all these measured information have to be linked back to the raw data. And the ontology, therefore, is a bit of a data model and describes how everything is linked to each other. Yeah, okay, so you can see it. So this is this is a visualization of an ontology. It looks kind of complicated because it looks so different to what you and what originally I was used to. But I helped create this thing, right? And I'm not a rocket scientist, right? If I can do this, believe me, you can at least understand this as well. You can do this as well. It's not as difficult as you think. It's just basically saying what kinds of observations, what kinds of parameters that you've got, what they are, and how they relate to each other. I'm not going to take you through this, right? Because I'm not. But there you are. So together with these spreadsheets, so that's the actual content, the actual information, and the ontology, which is the organization of the information and the relationships between the different terms in these spreadsheets. That's the way we go about turning CSV, so these spreadsheets, into machine accessible, machine understandable, self-describing data formats. The data are packaged together in something called row crates, research object crates. This is basically a way to package files so that you explain what's in each file and you explain the relationship between the files. So for example, we have a repository in GitHub, and there's this rowcrate.metadata.json file, and this is the row crate file. Inside there, we have basically, this describes that repository. The repository was published on this date, it was generated at this time, it has this license, it has this title. It was created by this particular, well, Fliz. The access URL, so where you can get the data set, which is where the repository itself is, so that's this thing here. The description, a bunch of keywords, which are taken from controlled vocabularies, which say they help people search, if they want to do a search, they can find these from these keywords, what was generated by, and so various information about what's in the repository. We also describe the individual files in the repository, so this is one particular file. What is it? It's a file, it's CSV format. We derived it from a Google Sheet which we downloaded, and as you can see, it's still a work in progress. We need to put the URL of the Google Sheet in there. A description, keywords, a label, the URL where you can download that particular file from, the temporal and spatial coverage, and so on and so forth. So rowcrate describes all of the files. It can work in a federated way, so if there's data that you've put somewhere else, there's a particular issue with GitHub that there is a space limitation, and if you've got files that are gigabytes big, and you've got 100 of them, you can't put them on GitHub, so you can put the files somewhere else. and you can put a URL, you can describe it in here within this JSON file, but the download URL instead will be to some online accessible disk somewhere on your institute. So this is called a row crate data package. So using all of this information again, we turn these spreadsheets, these CSV files, into linked open data format. And particularly the format we use is something called Turtle. And a Turtle file looks a bit like this. It's very similar, as you can see. Certainly the layout, the formatting is very similar. So we have in here, what we've done is, if you remember the spreadsheets are basically a series of columns with information in them. The first column contains the event ID, so that's identification for a particular sampling event, when they went out and picked up a bucket of water from the sea. Then we've got an identification for the sample, so the bucket of water, that has an ID as well. Then we have ENA is the European Nucleotide Archive, so we also deposit our data in ENA, and we give it a type, an ID when we put it in ENA, so that's what that means. A site ID is the name of the site where the bucket of water was taken from. We give them all names. So that's an ID. Then we have the date and time. So these are all sorts of a bunch of different columns within our spreadsheet. And we've got, I don't know what, 30 or 40 columns in our spreadsheets. Then what you do is describe, so you've described some information about these particular columns. Then what you do is for each sort of spreadsheet that you've got, you have the rows of information. So in the first column, first row, the event ID is this. The sample ID is this. The sample ID ENA is that. The date time is that. So you said it's a date time, it's a string. And so you're entering the information in a way that a machine will be able to understand this. And there's all sorts of other things that you put in this Turtle file as well that help it make it self-describing and machine accessible, machine understandable. And then finally, all of this stuff we put on GitHub, and each GitHub repository we turn into a mini data site, so that all the different files, this is from some other repository that we have, are sort of accessible in this particular way. I'm not going to take you through this, but this is the human interface, but behind this and on the web page, we've got what's called content negotiation. So someone coming to this, a piece of software coming to this website can either ask to see the HTML version, or they can also see the XML version of the web page, and they see the information either in this way, or they will see that Turtle file, something like that Turtle file that I just showed. And if you put in the right keywords at the top, Google will find this as well. So it's a way of making, so if we want, when we finish and we put this on, you can Google the name of that data set or some keywords of the data set, and you will find it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Very interesting. I suspect there will be some feedback or some ideas. Anyone wants to start?
What do you give as a recommendation to either individual researchers or institutes when people leave the field? And should everything be fine to work when they leave, can never be contacted again, or should there still be some sort of...
The reason you make a data management plan in the beginning and do the data management from the beginning is that by the time you finish the project, the data should be described. It should be put somewhere where everyone knows it is. It should be put somewhere online. So if they leave, and it should be self-describing, so there should be enough provenance information so you know what this file is, these files are, so that it doesn't matter if they leave. Right? The only thing the institute has to do is, well, the only thing, what the institute working and the individual have to do is decide they're going to do this, write a data management plan, decide online repositories or make your own online repository. You can put everything in GitHub and you can have a disk. And as long as that disk is, has data in that disk can be accessed via a URL, you can do it yourself that way. So you don't necessarily need to use a community archive if one doesn't exist. So in an ideal situation, they should not need to be contacted. The reason for the contact details, if nothing else, is for acknowledgement.
Anyone else? Thank you very much for the presentation. I was just wondering some real-life stories of you interacting with your colleagues. Obviously, you're a data management expert. I imagine the researchers are perhaps coming from all sorts of places, and they have to be introduced to the system. So from your experience, do you feel like once they're introduced, they're well versed in using the systems that you have presented today, and how much guiding or hand-holding do they need until they've learned how to do this, and how much effort do you put in every year maybe to introduce the new members of the team to this system? Just numbers and life experiences would be. Yeah.
Well, we deal with two types of researchers. We deal a lot with actually larger research infrastructures and larger research projects. And groupings like this Biodiversity Observation Network is a collaboration of 26 institutes working in a research infrastructure called EMBRC. It's the European Marine Biological Resource Centre. And they do a lot of research which is deliberately intended to be shared from the very beginning. So you will have people at the marine station who will do these observations. They will go and do the collection, and they are told, this is where you put your data, this is where you enter your values, these are the IDs that you have to use. So they have some experience with doing that, although I have to say, we do have to still teach them what it means, so the concepts, and why they're doing this. And what we have to do is to set it all up. If we don't set it all up for them, then obviously it's going to be difficult for them to do, and it's going to be difficult for all the 26 institutes to do the same thing. At IvS, we do a lot of data management teaching. It's still something that's not taught at the university level. It's at all. Yet, at some point, they're all expected to be able to do it. So we fill that gap by doing a lot of teaching. We do a lot of create a lot of online courses as well. And it's a steep learning curve, a steep and long learning curve, for the reason that they're expected to do data management, but they're not paid extra to do the data management, which is a really big problem with the scientific infrastructure and the scientific community and the way the universities work. They don't give the people the extra time. And it's not a lot of extra time, but it is extra time, and they need the professional help. They need the tools that we develop. Once it's explained why it's important, and once they see the benefit of someone has used their data set and cited them, or they themselves, because there are a lot of projects that require to gather together a lot of data from places, and every single researcher I've talked to who's had to do this kind of research has said what a nightmare it is trying to Google to get these. It takes them months and months. Yet when these databases set up, and it's a click of a button to get the same data. So they understand it, but they still need our help to create the tools that allow them to do that. And they still need, universities are still not placing, they're basically doing it because they're paid to do it, and they have to do it because the EU says they have to do it, but they don't actually really give the support. There's still that bit missing, unfortunately.
Yeah, so from your last point, I have a feeling that standardization is the way to go, right? Is there any, let's say, at least on a European level, maybe a standard way to, for example, publish temperature, or you use your own temperature definitions?
Yeah, so in marine biology, obviously, that's my experience, there are some institutes that do nothing but produce vocabularies and ontologies, and they produce, so they don't just define the terms, but they do all the infrastructure behind it, so these terms can be machine accessible, machine understandable. There's an awful lot of mapping that has to be done. There's still a lot of vocabularies, and so there's a lot of mappings that have to be done, and the temperature in here means this in here. But they do exist in marine biology. There's an awful lot of I'd say there's more different types of measurements in marine biology to be made than there is in astrophysics. Probably, well, quite a lot more. But you still also in astrophysics do have, it would be useful for there to be a vocabulary. And I think it would probably be easier to manage because you've got less diversity of
Sure.
different types of measurements. But definitely, yes, there's a lot of money going into producing these vocabularies and making them machine accessible and understandable.
Okay.
Apart from standardization, there is also something called centralization. So in astronomy, we have the CDS in Strasbourg. Is there something similar in marine biology?
Actually, we're moving away from centralization to federation. There's the European Ocean Biogeographic System, which is a centralized database where people upload their observations. So it's spreadsheets and it's observations of occurrences of creatures, of species. There are archives where you put, there's a lot of microscopy data, images taken, there's plankton databases. But we're slowly, in the last year or two, moving away to a more federated approach whereby people can put their data wherever they want. If they are machine accessible, understandable, and self-described, they can then, these archives can harvest the data themselves, and Google can find them themselves as well. So it doesn't matter where the data are, but the information about them is in one place.
Okay, anyone else has an idea or opinion?
So, of course, in astronomy you have the great FITS standard that everybody's, well, of course, that is the dictionary for observations that we have been using for a century almost. And I think it's a great advantage compared to, for instance, marine biology, where more,
Yes.
but that's only for observations, because big observatories drive this, and everybody's adhering to it. But I think even if people produce, for instance, model outputs, they will generate maybe their own obscure binary format or obscure formats like HDF file, whatever. And but I think what you say about dictionaries, it exists for the observations, the FITS dictionaries. If we put in OBSTEM, I mean, there's a couple of things we always use, but I'm not aware of any dictionary that, for instance, is labeling column names or units or quantities that are generated by models. Are there also dictionaries not only for observation but also for modeling in your in marine biology field?
Well, these dictionaries, these vocabularies are for terms. So where the carbon is measured, you have terms for carbon, right? But you have terms for measured carbon in brackish water, measured carbon in seawater. You've also got terms for carbon computed from a model. So there's actually quite a diversity of ways of terms that you can put in a vocabulary. Once you've got the setup, you can put an infinite number of terms in there. So there are terms, that have been put in there to describe outputs from particular codes.
Maybe a follow-up question, but if you add too many terms in the dictionary, wouldn't that just cause the problem in the first place? Then everyone defines something else? Follow-up question. If you would define too much terms in the dictionary, wouldn't you... If you would add too much terms in the dictionary, wouldn't that cause a problem in the first place?
There is an issue with too many terms because you won't necessarily know exactly which one is describing your situation. And in fact, the approach should be, for example, should be a term for temperature. There should be a term for from in water. There should be a term for in the Celsius. And then you string these three together to make temperature from water in Celsius. And yes, if you can end up, and we are ending up with having too many terms in the dictionary, but at least it has a URL which points to a term where the concept of that term doesn't change. Some of the information may change, but the URL is persistent. It's a persistent and unique identifier, and that at least is there and exists.
Do you trust that GitHub will still exist in 30 years?
And what?
Do you trust that GitHub will still exist in 30 years?
If it's still being used by community, then yeah, I do.
Okay, any other questions? If not, then let's thank Katrina again. Thank you very much.